Hello, my name is Dr. Coreyleewrenn. I am a vegan sociologist, and I am the co-founder, along with Dr. Zoe Sutton, of the International Association for Vegan Sociologists, and I'm the past chair of the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association. In this video, I'm going to explain to you the new, the fascinating, and the very much needed subfield of vegan sociology. So stick around and I will explain to you 5 of the key tenets to a vegan sociological perspective and practice. Vegan sociology is a critical feminist theory, a conflict-based theory that centers a multi-species society. So what that means is that it draws quite a bit on lots of critical theories like Marxism, but also it very much so explicitly draws on feminist approaches to sociology. And the idea is to be more inclusive, to be more generalizable, and to be more accurate, and to better serve our communities. Vegan sociologists argue that humans are not the only sentient persons impacted by human society. And in fact, it behooves us to expand our theoretical lens to include other animals, because the reality of the world is, Cassie right on cue, the reality of the world for humans is that we live very much so entangled lives with other species than humans. And so sociology would be, could only be bettered and be made more accurate, if you will, by including relationships with other animals, which are actual factual reality of human life. So one of the things that we do is we go back and we look at some of the classic theorists like Weber, Durkheim, Marx, and we look at some of the more contemporary theorists like Goffman or Garfinkel or, a lot of the symbolic interactionalists. Mead is a big one. So we look at, Bourdieu, can't leave him out. So we look at quite a lot of the classical and the contemporary theories that are considered the canon in sociological practice and in the classroom. And we consider how, if we revisit these theories, actually, they have a lot to say about a multi-species society. But we're also looking at these theories to understand why it is that we came to be in this position in our field in the 21st century, where despite living in a very multi-species world, we stubbornly focus just on the human. So in addition to revisiting some of the classics and classic contemporaries, if you will, we're also interested in vegan sociology in sort of pulling out some of those social theorists that may have been lost to history, who actually advocated a more multi-species approach to social science. In fact, if you do look at some of these earlier kind of the foundational people who are considered the canon, they're a lot more forgiving of that species barrier than we are today. So a lot of folks like Durkheim was very much so interested in looking at animal communities to understand social solidarity for human communities. That said, we can also look to other social theorists who've just been all but forgotten in the history and in the sort of political construction of the sociological canon. So we can look to folks like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who is now starting to be remembered in some more inclusive takes on the sociological canon. But a lot of folks who are being exposed to Gilman are seeing her because she's a feminist and a socialist, so she's interested in how societies come to be how they are and how we might organize them better. But one thing that a lot of people don't recognize is that actually she was a vegetarian and an animal rights activist, and she also was very much so interested, like Durkheim, in looking at how other animals organize their communities and how that could inform the human species as well. But she was a little bit more radical in that she argued that the status of women was very much so entangled with the status of fellow animals, and envisioned ways in which we might have a society that is more forgiving to non-human animals and thereby more forgiving to women and other down and out marginalized groups. So that's just one example of many early sociological thinkers or social thinkers that we might revisit. Another one that I've been thinking about is Henry Salt. Henry Salt was a scholar activist who was very much so involved in animal rights and feminism and other kinds of intersectional approaches to understanding how society works and how we might better society. But Henry Salt, of course, is much more famous for doing his animal rights work. So we might look at Henry Salt, but there's many, many others that we might investigate to reimagine a more inclusive, multi-species focused sociological canon. Vegan sociology is also interested in more contemporary theories, as I mentioned. So this brings me to point number 3. It's not just about kind of figuring out these classic theories and how animals might fit into that, and how that, of course, would inform our understanding of society today. But obviously, we had a whole bunch of other people who've been working in the early 20th century up to the mid to late 20th century who we would consider contemporary sociological theorists. And they've also had quite a lot to offer. So, as I said, symbolic interaction is a major area of understanding how we as selves are developed and how the individual is shaped within the context of society. And when we start to open up that lens to include other animals, it becomes a very fascinating way of understanding these theories in a new, fresh light. So, is it possible, for instance, for a non-human animal to have a sense of self? I would argue yes. Is it possible for non-human animals to exhibit culture, to have culture, and to experience cultural evolution? I would argue yes. Do animals have a recognition of the generalized other? All kinds of interesting questions that we can pull from these contemporary sociologies of the self and individualism and the interaction between agency and structure, et cetera, et cetera. And vegan sociologists, of course, would also argue that regardless if we can evidence some of these theories or ideas about non-humans and their inner worlds, one thing we do know for sure is that non-human animals as individuals and communities are very much so structured by a human supremacist society. So even free-living animals you might consider wildlife, who maybe will never physically interact with a human being, their life chances are still determined by being an animalized other, basically, in a human supremacist global society. Because even non-human animals that never meet another human or will ever meet a human, their life chances are impacted by climate change, by habitat loss, et cetera, et cetera. So again, non-human animals are very much so relevant to contemporary sociological thought, even if we can't evidence some of these theories that Mead, Cooley, Goffman, Bourdieu, etc. may have predicted for or theorized for humans. To that point, it brings me to number 4, and this is that vegan sociology is very deeply committed to intersectionality. And again, this is a reference to that sort of feminist tradition that we have. So traditionally, sociology has always had a multivariable sort of approach to our analysis, race, class, gender being the obligatory 3. But when we're looking at an intersectional perspective in sociological thought and practice, we're asking other sociologists and practitioners to expand that beyond, to also think about sexuality, age, nationality, ability, and especially for vegan sociologists, we're also saying nature matters, the environment matters, but really non-human animals also are persons who matter. And it's really, really fascinating that it's not just a matter of checking off all these boxes. Intersectionality is not additive in that way. It can't be summed up like, well, this, add that in, add this in, add that in, tally it up, and then what do you get? That's not actually how intersectionality, as Patricia Hill Collins and other Black feminists have understood it. Actually, intersectionality asks us to consider what is uniquely happening at that intersection of these different variables. There's something very unique then, for instance, about being a female-bodied, non-human animal, say, in the food system. So while there might be some really interesting intersections between me as a female-bodied human being, I experience reproductive injustice or sexual assault, all these types of things that I'm confronted with as a female-bodied human. We see that also happening for non-human animals in human society. But also, I can't say that my experience as a female-bodied person is fully sort of collapsible with that of, say, a pig. Pigs are experiencing something altogether different. While my identity and my social category, women are very much so culturally consumed in media and pornography and unpaid labor, etc. When we're looking at pigs, their actual bodies are being consumed. Or dairy cows, their actual breast milk is being consumed. So there's some really interesting intersections in how say, and using this example, how gender and species work in similar ways, but also intersectionality is encouraging us to actually sit with those intersections and look at those unique experiences and what we can learn from them. How does that challenge our theory? And so the examples are really many and very fascinating, and too many for this video. But what I wanted to emphasize here is that this is a very core part of vegan sociology, and that is thinking and researching and analyzing in an intersectional way. On the other hand of that, while vegan sociology is really encouraging sociology to think about non-human animals and their experience, it's also the case that good sociology needs to think about animality, because we see very clear patterns of women being animalized, people of color being animalized, people with disabilities being animalized, older folks being animalized, people from other countries being animalized, et cetera, et cetera. And so animality, the social category of animality, is very fundamental to the social construction of different identities, the maintenance of institutions and systems, and it really does determine allocation of resources. So any good practicing sociologist, whether or not they care about non-human animals, which I think is a problem, but even if they don't, any good practicing sociologist should pay attention to animality, because it is so very fundamental to the shaping of our society and the reproduction of systems of inequality. So this brings me to number 5, the last major point I want to get across, the major tenet of vegan sociology, and that is it is liberatory. It is explicitly vegan. Now, it's contextually vegan as well. So we recognize, being feminist scholars and intersectional scholars, we recognize that the food system is very institutionalized and it's rife with inequalities regarding access and availability and quality and all those types of things. So vegan sociology is not mandating everybody go vegan, but it is envisioning, as a utopian sort of theory, it is envisioning ultimately a vegan society, because we understand that plant-based eating is infinitely better for the environment. It's infinitely better for human bodies and human communities. And of course, it's the best for non-human animals who are not going to be killed for food and beverages and etc. anymore. So when we're advocating veganism in vegan sociology, basically there's 2 things to understand with that. Number 1 is that we do so with the expectation that folks will have to adjust accordingly. So even the vegan society defines veganism as reducing your reliance on non-human animal products as much as practicable, which varies based on your social position, right? So it's an ideal, and we do the best that we can within a system that is very much so speciesist, based on the oppression, exploitation, and domination of non-human animals. So we're doing the best that we can. However, when we're also using this word vegan, we're meaning that this is a sort of stand-in for liberation. So this is what makes us as a subfield distinct from the more traditional animal studies, or in sociology we call it animals in society. So that's been around since about the year 2000. So about 25 years, a quarter of a century since it's been created, as I'm recording this in 2026. So that's been around for a long time. And basically, Zoe and I and other vegan sociologists, we simply got a bit frustrated with the institutionalization of that project. When it was initially pushed through, it was very difficult, as you can imagine, because of the biases and ultimately the bigotry of traditional sociology. It's very difficult for these early sociologists to push through their agenda to get animals in society recognized as a legitimate area of study. So unfortunately, what has happened is that there was a lot of compromise that had to take place. Although it was envisioned to be very radical and liberatory, very quickly it sort of fell into being more, well, anybody and anyone who's studying animals can be a part of this field, and there's absolutely no perspective or position taken on killing animals or harming animals. And frankly, you would never expect to see that kind of compromise in other types of critical perspectives or theory in sociology. I could never imagine, for instance, the sex and gender section of the American Sociological Association saying, well, as long as you study women, you can be a part of this, but we won't have a position against sexual assault or things like that. It's like, yeah, of course you're going to have a position against sexual assault because this is a feminist section, a theme, or it's called themes here in the UK. But we don't do that. We don't do the same for non-human animals. It's because non-human animals have been so objectified that people who have no interest whatsoever in liberating them and definitely objectify them and don't see them as sentient persons have been a major part of the sociological animals in society project. And that we felt was deeply problematic and very antithetical to the original aims of that section. So unfortunately, because of the larger sort of pressures on the animals in society sections, and this is not, I'm using the United States as an example because at the time I was a chair, but this was something that was happening globally. And folks were just tired of having to compromise, but they recognized that there's a lot of stress on these small sections to stay afloat. You want to maximize your membership, especially after the digital revolution. More and more people are not coming to conferences, and we have a neoliberalization of the university system, which means there's less and less funding available to support these types of things. So there's a huge pressure then to maximize membership for these study groups. And so whenever you see this sort of corruption of capitalism, you start to see a compromise in our ethics and our values. So that's one of the reasons, that's the main reason really we started the International Association for Vegan Sociologists, so that we could do real vegan sociology without having to sell out. And we do it on a shoestring budget. But that's vegan sociology in a nutshell. We're intersectional, we're critical, we're feminist, we're global, we're environmental, we're very eco, and we are anti-capitalist. That's another major part of vegan sociology, is we have a very strong critique of the capitalist system. So there's an underlying sort of Marxist element to us. Not that everybody identifies in that way, but very much so. Everyone has a very strong capitalist critique going. Because that's ultimately what we argue is at the foundations of what's happening to non-human animals and the environment, is that this is capitalism run rampant and objectifying the life world in every way, shape, or form. So vegan sociology then is arguing that these are valid things to study, that non-human animals are persons and they're worthy of social research. And there's also a lot of exciting developments, especially from folks in the Australia area, lots of exciting developments in how we might update our methodologies to include non-human animals as persons, as subjects as well. So stay tuned. Feel free to subscribe to this channel where I'll talk more about vegan sociology here and there. And also, for sure, check out the International Association for Vegan Sociologists. It's vegansociology.com. We have an annual conference that's free to attend, and we are very inclusive to independent scholars, to retired folks, to students, graduate students, undergraduate students, early career scholars, you name it. We're meaning to sort of push back on a lot of those problems in mainstream professional sociology in order to make sociology fit for purpose in a multi-species 21st century society.